All right. So, but let me slightly counter argue on this one, and I'll say why. Because I think that where we are situated currently. So, for example, when you're driving a car, sometimes you need to turn the steering wheel to the right. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you're so far over here that you need to turn it for a while or turn to the left, right? But that doesn't mean that in every case on every road, you're turning the steering wheel in that direction. That is a correct. We may be so off course, need to turn the steering wheel in this direction for a long period, and that is correct, but not forever. Okay, and so why do I say that? So I would not assign zero value to patriotism, to loyalty, to so on. And the thing is, and here's the problem. The problem is, if you defected from the US to the Soviet Union at that time, people would also, you're not exactly the same stilted language as, it wouldn't sound exactly what the Soviet propaganda or East German propaganda sounded like, but they would say, you're a traitor, you're a commie. I can't believe you betrayed America. Hope you like it over there in a gulag. The difference is they'd kind of be right. They'd be right that actually you had, because there were a lot of, foolish people who did go and think that life in the Soviet Union was better. Right. Mm-hmm. And so it's not, so while I agree that the axis of status versus non-status is often a valuable axis. Okay. Mm-hmm. I am more from the Lee Kuan Yew school of thought, which says it is about emigration and immigration as opposed to other variables. I think that it's almost like if we push it up to that meta level, if people can choose and do choose to enter or exit, that is the ultimate vote on a society. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that people that were dumb went from the state of the US to the USSR. It is true that they were making a bad decision, but it's also true in a sense that they were disloyal. And let me explain this for a second, right? Mm-hmm. Basically, at least, and robots will change this, okay? But at least to protect property today, in today's environment, you do need police and military. And those guys are risking their lives and are not paid that well. So they need to have something higher than themselves that they believe in. In the past, that was like the church. And today it is the state. And, I'm a patriot and I salute that flag and, so on and so forth. Right. Yeah. And if you don't have that, what you get is the guys who are pure muscle for hire, which is like Blackwater or Academy. Mercenaries. Yeah. And then what you start to get is like a meta-rational issue where the price of security becomes so expensive and these guys can flip on you and the other guy can pay them more. And now they're taking all your stuff because the law just changed. Guess what? Because you can't enforce the law. This is the kind of stuff that people will sometimes make fun of libertarians for not thinking through or what have you. Right. But I'm not saying we're close to that today, but I actually think we will be there in 5 or 10 or 15 years at the current rate we're going, because the combination of what the current establishment is doing, they're abolishing, when the police have been abolished and the military is defeated, it's all decentralized defense. Yeah. And that, I know that sounds provocative, right? But that is like the guy at Walgreens that I tweeted about recently. He has to solve the thefts himself because the police won't do it. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Those Afghans, they need to defend themselves. Maybe they should always be defending themselves, but they couldn't get on the plane. Now they have to defend themselves against the Taliban. They're going to fight the civil war for themselves. Right. Mm-hmm. So, but those things start to converge until you have towns and cities, I think in the US where, maybe not cities, but that retreat that first happens from abroad. And then eventually, I think you're going to see American disunion in a 10 to 20 year time frame. Mm-hmm. Maybe I can talk about that scenario because that kind of leads into our other stuff. That actually pulls us back to the beginning with the military.
Yeah, we do have that on the docket. So I just want to drill into this a bit because it's an interesting topic. So in your view, then patriotism almost subsidizes the cost of communized defense, this is where I think it's a critical distinction.
I think we're evolved for it also. Yeah.
national defense, I mean, that itself is a communistic model, right? We're all paying for it. We're all sharing it. We're all enjoying the benefits of it. So it seems to me like that's one industry that we have never had a true libertarian experiment in. We've never disbanded the national military and seen.
We didn't. The U.S. did not used to have a standing military.
So
it was a civil war because it was defended kind of by the oceans and so on, right?
Okay,
go ahead.
Well, my thought there is that it has been suppressive to experimentation. So it's like I wasn't aware actually at the time we had tried the decentralized mode of defense.
Well, it's like, the original U.S. colonies is every man had a musket, and there wasn't, because the thing is you didn't have mechanized warfare, right?
Yeah.
You didn't have tanks, you didn't have planes, you didn't have machine guns, and so go ahead.
So there's been a big asymmetry of warfare as a result of mechanization or industrialization. But now aren't we kind of going back the other direction where the asymmetry is being reduced again? So you would assume, with 3D printing of guns and anti-aircraft drones or whatever, this asymmetry of combat is getting reduced again. So
yes, but this is going to, it's going to happen fast, but this is what this century is about. I think a huge part of it. So here's kind of like my compact mental model of, the near future. This is a scenario. I don't put 100% confidence in it, but let's call this my base case for what happens. Okay. Yeah. So forces in the world that I see right now are NYT, CCP, BTC, okay, respectively, woke capital, communist capital, crypto capital. Mm-hmm. And just starting with the Chinese, so the Chinese point on the triangle for a second. With communist capital, they say you must submit, meaning the Chinese party is dominant, you've got to submit to them. With woke capital, they say you must sympathize. And so here you must bow your head because you're white, because you're male, because you're straight, because you're cis. In theory, see, the Chinese are saying to bow your head because they're powerful, because the Chinese state is powerful, because the CCP is powerful. The wokes are saying to bow your head because you're powerful, but it ends up in the same place, which is eyes downcast, give all your money, right? An ideology of submission, right? This is just the left-handed version, slightly more subtle version, but it's the same thing. And then you get crypto capital, and crypto capital is, BTC is you must be sovereign. So it's distinct from the other two poles, which are you must submit, you must sympathize. This is you must be sovereign. And you must be sovereign says hold your head up high, do everything yourself as much as you can, not just hold your private keys, but like run your own node and but grow your own food and hold your own gun and have your own education and homeschool your kids and do everything because you're neither submitting to the state nor buying into the woke language of sympathy. Okay. So these are 3 points on the triangle. But the thing is that the exact opposite of them, I argue, is actually also bad. Even though each of these three things are like powerful points, I don't think either full submission or full lack of submission is good. Full submission is the CCP. Full lack of it is, people going into Walgreens in San Francisco and being able to steal $900 on command. That is like zero state, right? Full sympathy leads you to, the woke craziness of, this lawsuit of like $137 million at Tesla. I mean, that's just like stupid money for frankly, nothing, right? This is other people. If you read the details of the suit, it doesn't seem legitimate. So that gets you over here, where ultimately that means nobody can do any business because everybody's constantly complaining, faking being a victim. It's much easier to fake being a loser than to fake being a winner, to fake being a victim than a champion. Then the other extreme of that is also something you don't want. That's like Russia in the 90s, because communism had bleached all of the sympathy out of everybody. Every single appeal to collective sacrifice, shared anything. Right. They were all so cynical about all of that is a grand theft auto like society, Russia in the 90s, and people who live there will tell you that, like the mafia type state. And so you don't want the total absence of sympathy either. And then finally, sovereignty. Look, obviously I'm sympathetic to sovereignty. I've been a very early, Bitcoin proponent. I don't know if you noticed, but I taught a class in 2013 with 250,000 people into Bitcoin, and we helped. We set up Coin Center with Alex Morkos as a core dev in 2014. I was co-founder of that, and blah blah. There's 50 things that I've done for that. Not to brag, just saying, very early supporter, and obviously believe in Bitcoin. But I recognize also that practically not everybody can be completely sovereign. Not everybody's a computer scientist. I can read the cryptography code, but I cannot expect everybody else to go and do that. I can download and build, source. I can look at Wireshark or Little Snitch and look at packets going out. And but it's not realistic for me to ask everybody to do that. Then you might say, well, people can hold their private keys. Okay, sure. But how many people bought their Bitcoin through a fiat to Bitcoin exchange? It's probably 99%, if not more. How did they do it, through mining or local Bitcoins? More power to them. Like a cash exchange, I'm sure that's possible, but they probably did it for cash. They probably used fiat. There's some compromise they made, right? Yeah. And they were not, quote, completely sovereign, because being, quote, completely sovereign would mean you're not just holding your own Bitcoin, you're growing your own food and your own water. And it might sound like a caricature, but it's not, because there's many times and places in history, and we're seeing all the supply chain shocks now, where you cannot take that for granted, that there aren't lots of vendors who will get you chips or, this good or that good, and who do have you, by the throat on that particular good. So being completely sovereign means you're building all of this stuff. The complete lack of sovereignty means you're vulnerable to these supply chain disruptions, but you also can't build them all yourself. So somewhere in the middle. So you put that together. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. You're going to finish the point. I just want to. I just want to go into that whenever. Sorry to interrupt.
Fine.
Sovereignty versus self-sufficiency, because I think there might be some disconnect on our definitions of these.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So, for me, sovereignty means nobody can veto you. So sovereignty is basically like the number of people who can veto you. Now, the thing is, and it's continuous, right? Because no one is going to be able to veto you on, you could have a table of actions, and then how many people can veto you on that, right? Like moving a chair across your room, nobody cares. You have root access to that. Okay. But building a shed outside, tons of people will be able to veto you on that. Right. You cannot go and opt in with your neighbor today to go and do a duel. You can if it's like an MMA fight, like highly ritualized. There's all these waivers and stuff, like boxing matches are illegal. So there's some residual aspect of that, but you can't just consent to go and knock somebody out, or not easily. And you start going through a list of actions versus how many people need to consent to it. And some of them, are as I said, the shed things in the physical world have lots of people who need to sign off. It's insane. Getting an ice cream parlor going in San Francisco, for example, is an incredible bureaucratic maze, right? And not that profitable either. This guy who spent $200,000 on ice cream parlor, he should just put it into Bitcoin. Poor guy. He learned what it was, to try to build something in the physical world in 2020's America. So that's what sovereignty means, in my view, is how many people can veto you on what action.
So my modification to that would be, in a free market, as Mises says, consumers are sovereign, which in my mind, I would define as the ability to act as one sees fit. So uncoerced. So we'd say the ultimate, if 100% taxation is a slave, 0% taxation is a sovereign, effectively. It does not incur any taxation whatsoever, or coercion. You could put vetoes in there as well. So in my mind, a free market of sovereign actors mitigates that risk, that single point of failure that you're identifying, or how many people can veto you. Because if you get vetoed by a producer, whether it's of sheds or any other good or service, you have recourse to their competitors to go and, seek procurement elsewhere.
Right. Okay. So a couple of things about that. One is that does presume that there is some enforcer of property rights, who's there, like a police force or a state.
Yes. So this is where and this is a great question, because I'm like, what happens post Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin's the one property you don't need the enforcer of. So what do we do for the physical property? And we were
it changes.
We were touching on this earlier with decentralization of defense.
Right.
And this is kind of sovereign individual thesis as well. It seems like we might, on the spectrum of security, centralization, or governance, we'd slide back towards the monarchy model, like away from the centralized nation state towards a more decentralized monarchy model.
Yes. So well, okay, right. So basically, I think that's only partially the case now, and let me explain why I think that. So in the same way, the U.S. has changed a lot over the last 7 or 8 years. It was just a different country in 2012 prior to what Matt Iglesias calls the Great Awakening, like the Great Awakening. Do you know what the Great Awakening is?
I've heard of the Great Awakening taking place. It was supposed to be this transformation in consciousness, right? But it became wokeism.
Yeah, well, so right. So basically, this is something where there have been Christian revivals at different times and places in American history, right? Mm-hmm. Those are called like Great Awakenings. Everyone's like, yeah, and the thing about it is, religious fundamentalism isn't always pretty. Mm-hmm. And the form that it's taken in the present day is the Great Awakening, which is a very clever term, right? Because wokeness is, as Tom Holland, he's got a book called Dominion, goes through the history of all these movements, as how they have their roots in Christianity. Wokeness is basically, an Abrahamic offshoot, just like communism is. That is to say, like, Winston Churchill had the saying, "Communism is Christianity with a tomahawk," and the reason for that is it's about like total equality, and it's militant. Like I think we've talked about this, but Christianity was in some ways like the original communism. It tore down the Roman Empire. A rich man would sooner go through the eye of a needle than get to heaven, that type of stuff, right? There was basically a religion that, allowed slaves to feel that, they were being oppressed and the Romans were evil with some justification, and it tore it down. And by the end of the Roman Empire, they were apologizing for their previous lack of Christianity, much as CEOs today apologize for their previous lack of diversity. The fundamental basis of what they had done, they were now guilty about. The old gods were no longer something that everybody had faith in. And then the whole thing fell apart because it just didn't have that motive force anymore. Then, after a lot of bubbling and trouble, after the Dark Age and so on, you had this Germanization of Christianity, where memes that were just totally distinct started getting fused together. Like Saint Nicholas, if you think about it, that's Santa Claus and snow is thought of at Christmas time next to the scene from the manger in Bethlehem and the desert. So how is this scene from like the snowy tundra or whatever being fused with a desert scene? And the answer is because it's two different folk cultures that came together. Okay. It is really just two totally different things that are fused. And Santa Claus and Jesus have basically nothing to do with each other. They're just two different traditions that have come into the same thing. And we replicate them next to each other without thinking about it. It's like in biology, there's so-called horizontal gene transfer, for example, between bacteria, where you can just copy and paste some DNA, splat it in there, and just kind of go with it, right?
Yeah.
It's peanut butter and jelly, right?
That's interesting, right there, the horizontal gene transfer, because that's how mycelium, they have a very adaptive response to their environment because they slurp up their competitors' genetic material, right? And so you're kind of describing this collision.
Actually, I don't know the biology of mycelium, but go tell me more.
Well, they just if a mycelial mat is, it's kind of like nature's internet, is the rough analogy. It lives underground. The mushrooms are just the sex organs that pop up every now and then, but the mycelium is a large subterranean organism, and if it encounters a threat at any one point, whatever, a bacteria or a microbe or some kind, it will adapt a way to neutralize that threat and then pass the message out into the rest of the mycelium, so that if it encounters the threat anywhere else, it can overcome it. So it has has a horizontal gene transfer is the gist of it. Hey everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin.
Interesting.
The way you're describing this collision of cultural systems, there's a similar horizontal gene transfer between the two.
Yes. And here's the thing about it is what happened is eventually after the Dark Ages, the Holy Roman Empire arose. And, you can see it kind of like, at least in the name, it's a fusion between Christianity and the Roman Empire. And you started to get this previously oxymoronic concept, a Christian king, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was like this totally oxymoronic concept. Mm-hmm. And what happened was essentially the words and the optics were replicated, but the substance was hollowed out. So it's sort of like the ideology propagated, but in a non-virulent form, like an attenuated virus, right? And that's actually, I think, a good analogy where it's no longer tearing down the empire in the same way. And then, you had later, you had obviously Protestant, we're skipping forward like hundreds of years, but you had Protestantism, which, Martin Luther went and did something similar to what Christianity did to the Roman Empire, where he said, hey, the Catholic Church is corrupt. It's selling indulgences. We need to revolt against it. And so that became essentially another like communistic, you could call it communistic, you could call it revolutionary ideology that justified individual overthrow of the centralized church. And that led to these, really bloody religious wars of Europe and actually the modern Peace of Westphalia. And then what happened was those Protestants, just like the Christians, who tore down the Roman Empire, eventually fused and became, an empire themselves, right? And that's like over hundreds of years. It was not an immediate thing. Those Protestants, well, guess what happened to some of them? Their descendants eventually became the WASP establishment of the United States and ran their own empire, right? So there's like that cycle that we start to see. There's more examples of this. Another example is the communism, right? Like, so communism itself was, this, incredibly viral religious-like ideology. Why religious? It was the fervor of religion. Basically, it spread from a book in the 1800s to cover like half the Earth's surface. Everybody from, Chinese people, Russian people, African people, American people, India. It appealed to a lot of people around the world. It grew really fast. It was a universal religion that anybody could adopt. And it was new. And so what happened with communism is interesting, where over time, it merged with, it started out as being implacably opposed to religion, nationalism. All of those things were considered relics of the past. We were going to have international communist revolution where states don't matter. Religion is the opiate of the masses, all the types of the Trotskyists, like burn it all down, destroy everything, rob everybody, basically. Trotsky commanded the Red Army, by the way. Like, lots of people are like, oh, Trotsky was good and Lenin was bad. Like, there's a good essay called Lenin Think, by, I think, Gary Morse and Gary Saul Morrison. And basically just about how like Lenin was like a ruthless killer. There's another good book called Trotsky in New York by Kenneth Ackerman, just kind of shows how they financed the Russian Revolution. Read that alongside, and there's an NYT article called Was Lenin a German Agent? Unusually for the NYT, they actually printed something interesting. There's also another book on this if people are interested, by Sean McMeekin, A New History of the Russian Revolution. And he basically says that the reason it happened was because of the Russian Russia's involvement in World War I, which sets the conditions for the Communist Revolution. But coming up, so the What happened was communism obviously in Russia fused with Russian nationalism because Stalin found that people didn't want to die for communism, but they would fight for Mother Russia. Mm-hmm. So it became socialist nationalism versus the German nationalist socialism, right? And then many years later, so that's an example of sort of replicating the hammer and sickle, while making it more nationalistic, and it's kind of a fusion with elements that are previously rejected. But the most important version is probably, at least today, the modern version is the Chinese Communist Party, mm-hmm. which is very much a nationalist party. It has fused traditional, for a time under Mao, under Chinese communism, it was all about destroying all the olds, destroy the four olds, smash old temples, smash old statues. Your parents are evil. Filial piety was a huge part of Chinese culture for many years. So this was a total inversion of what Chinese culture was. Mm-hmm. And then what happened was Deng Xiaoping basically in 78, took over China. And he's like, you know what? We can mutter some stuff about this is communist, that is communist. We recognize that communism contains within itself all these contradictions. You can quote communist scripture to justify X and not X for any value of X. Okay. Both that, of course, war is terrible, we're against the imperialists, and one must kill to defend the motherland, right. That kind of, or not to defend, to defend against the imperialists and the capitalists, right? Mm-hmm. So he recognized that. And so he basically was able to come up with verbal arguments in Chinese to justify anything as being communist, okay? And because of that, they were able to essentially fuse communism with capitalism and nationalism such that you can have stirring patriotic anthems that celebrate traditional Chinese culture next to a gigantic hammer and sickle. So that's like the Christian king. It's like the communist nationalist.
Right.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to throw this inquiry in there.
So that's also, by the way, woke capital is also like that, by the way. Woke capital is a fusion of this revolutionary ideology, tear it all down, with huge swaths of money, right? Right. So you see the Christian king, the communist nationalist, woke capital, these are things where you've kind of got the priest and the warrior or the merchant, or some form of power over here.
And it is
like a left-right fusion.
The contradictions that ultimately destroy them too, right?
Sometimes, but sometimes it's a very stable state because basically the left provides the moral justification and the right provides the power. Mm. Right? So go ahead.
So my question is, what is the common denominator when these institutions are overthrown? Because it appears to me that when there is some severance to accountability to the preferences of the constituents, right? Like when Martin Luther nails the 9 to 5 Theses, it's because the constituents of the church are being economically victimized, taken advantage of, et cetera, right? Their preferences either aren't being reflected in the hierarchy, or perhaps the hierarchy has lost relevance due to technological change.
So it's a few things. Yes. It's basically something where, all right, so let's just talk explicit left-right for just a little bit. Okay. Mm-hmm. So one way of thinking about things is if you take all 7 billion people in the world and you have some ordering metric. Okay. For example, how German Aryan are they? Or how close are they to the powers of the US government? Like the levers of the US government, or how many US dollars do they have, or how much Bitcoin do they have, or how good at programming are they, or how Han Chinese are they? Okay. These are all ways that you could, in theory, order the world. Mm-hmm. And one way of thinking about it is for each such ordering, there's a cut point, and a right-wing ideology would define itself as all the people who are within this group. And because you're within this group on this ordering, you're in the top, part of it. You have an esprit de corps, you have a sense of belonging, you have a sense of purpose, you're the elect. There's a whole narrative that justifies why you're the best because you're on top of this particular ranking. Okay. Mm. And so it's exclusive. Now, in some ways that can be good because it's like a small, group of, a band that does really great things together. And of course it can be bad if it turns into the failure mode, which is kill or oppress all the people outside the group. Okay. Yep. But The opposite of that is a left-wing ideology, which takes a large set, okay, and that is as inclusive as possible, and it does the same axis, but it might be, for example, the 1% and the 99%, right? Or it might be, the capitalists and the workers, or it might be the oppressors and the oppressed, okay? And their framing is always, okay, we're going to build the largest possible group and include all these people against these evil guys. Problem is, the failure mode of that is to be, quote, so inclusive that you are,
equality of
cheek
outcome.
by jowl. What's that?
Equality of outcome.
Equality of outcome, yes, exactly. But it's also like you are in a Soviet gulag, slaving away with a, career criminal next to you, as happened to many people in the USSR. Like, yeah, you're equal, but everybody's equally bad.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm reminded, there's some quote that we're all equal in the grave.
Yeah, exactly. Like what it results in, because you're trying to make things equal that are not,
right.
And so, this random civilian is not the same as some like criminal who's tapping. There's actually a good movie called The Way Back, which is, I think it's got like Colin Farrell in it, actually. It's an unusual depiction of the gulag on the big screen. Okay. So you can actually kind of get a visual of what the thing was like, with political prisoners alongside criminals, So this guy was convicted for making a joke about Stalin. This guy was convicted for stabbing, and they're like, in the same bunk or whatever. Right. So that's kind of when you level it all out, and when you make all these verbal arguments of, well, who's the true criminal? The true criminal is, the one who is trying to, restore capitalism and restore oppression. And so his comments against Comrade Stalin, clearly he wants to restore the imperialist capitalist running dogs, so throw him in jail. But this guy, his stabbing is because he had a bad childhood and a bad upbringing. So let's like bring that, imprisonment down. And so, and it's to kind of level out to the same thing, right? Yeah. So that's a failure mode of that kind of ideology. And the thing is that, from a true like real politics standpoint, the ideologies that are successful are those that have like the sort of integral of like scale, like number of people, and like strength, like the strength of those folks. And, one of the reasons that, the Nazis lost was fundamentally that they were outnumbered by the USSR and the UK and, the US. Like had Hitler not thought that Slavs were inferior, maybe, like he might've had like slightly more demographics. I don't know. Right. Or like he might've been, might've had a bigger coalition. That was pretty stupid. The whole thing was stupid, but that was particularly stupid. And, by contrast, had the, what happened with the Soviets is their best people didn't feel like they were distinguished enough, so they wanted to leave, and so they, they absconded, they defected, and they complained, and eventually they brought down the regime. Right. So go ahead.
So there's clearly the hierarchy is advantageous to the collective, insofar as those that are the most competent inhabit the highest echelons of that hierarchy. But the hierarchy also needs to be adaptive, right? There needs to be mobility. As in, if you're not doing a good job at the top, there needs to be downward mobility. If you're doing a great job at the bottom, there needs to be upward mobility. If it ossifies at any point, or if you try to do away with a hierarchy, as communism does, it's a bad bet.
That's right. And so if you have a large group of people or a smart group of people, capable group of people who are outside the current hierarchy, but rising really fast, and the current hierarchy doesn't accommodate them, it's not long for this world, or you're going to have serious conflict. Okay. And so there's like an obvious version of that, which is China, US, right? And that people can see because it's state to state. A less obvious version, but it's also there, is certainly tech versus the East Coast establishment. And that's now something which is interesting, where it's kind of been a boxer's clinch, where there's a fight, then there's clinch, and now it's broken up into like centralized tech and media versus decentralized tech and media. Like decentralized tech and media, we've gotten Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi and all the people at Substack and so on and so forth. And they, centralized media has captured big chunks of centralized tech, and they've got a lot of censorship and so on. So we've got a lot of the talent and innovation and the writing, and they have a lot of the establishment. So it's an interesting swap that basically happened over the last couple of years. Okay. But for a while, it was basically East Coast versus West Coast.
Yeah.
And, I think in some ways there's more that is compounding out there, which is, I think will be more apparent by 2030 than 2020. Which is India and all the folks who have just gotten online. Like China's been compounding for a while, but that's another group that is kind of being mostly out of the game, that is getting in the game. And some people are really good at math and computer science and finance and stuff. And so hierarchies are going to flex to accommodate them as well, Gotcha. But it might be less adversarial than like the Chinese confrontation. And, so we'll see what happens with that. But it'll likely be much less adversarial than that, but basically it will be a change to hierarchies. Coming back up to the triangle, right? Yeah. Of, because this is kind of the macro model of communist capital, woke capital, crypto capital, right? NYT, CCP, BTC. See, the reason I think this is a good way of thinking about things, first is it represents like, 3 ideological points. I think it also says, for the reasons I went into, why we want to kind of make what I call the decentralized center, where it's a balance between sympathy, sovereignty, and submission. I'm not saying there's one ideal point there, but I do think there should be a trade-off. Like you've got some, it's like things on a slider. You can imagine what different societies look like, within that set, but it's not like pushed to one of the extremes without the other two, because I think that's where the reason is those poles are going to try to pull people to the extremes and say the other two are evil. China bans Bitcoin. China also cracked down on Hong Kong and, on the Great Firewall. So they're against both of these two. Obviously, Bitcoiners have maximum sympathy for NYT or CCP, and NYT is not exactly big Bitcoin holders or believers in, each corner does not like the other two, right? Yeah. And now of these, I think NYT, and the reason I say NYT, by the way, as opposed to the US government, is NYT is upstream of all media and the US government. Why? Because just to talk about this for a second, a book that I recommend everybody get just to kind of dispense with any mental bottlenecks or whatever is The Gray Lady Winked by Ashley Rinsberg. And this basically goes through and it shows that it's not like the New York Times just got bad and was in the past truthful. It's actually something that has been lying for generations. For example, one story that people often know is that they printed that the famine in the Ukraine was not really happening. And the guy who did it, Walter Duranty, was big with the communists and won a Pulitzer for it. And the New York Times still has the Pulitzer. They've refused to return the Pulitzer. So literally won a Pulitzer Prize for denying a genocide of 5 million people. That's just one of the most egregious examples, but there's so many more. Herbert Matthews, their correspondent, basically when Castro was on the run and people thought they had defeated the terrorist movement that eventually took over Cuba and turned it into a communist hellhole, he went and put a microphone to him and wrote this whole hagiographical thing in the New York Times that basically whitewashed the communism, and it made Castro out to be ambiguous in terms of his ideology. And this was sort of like, Osama bin Laden being defeated. Everybody thought he was dead. And then some reporter going and doing this huge interview to have him recruit for Al-Qaeda. It was at that level. Because that's what communism was. It was this terrorist movement that would take over states and turn them into charnel houses with mass murder. In fact, for many years, by the way, that's why for 16 years, the US government didn't recognize the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1933. That's why the nations of the world treated communism initially like they treated ISIS, as this crazy terrorist gang that had taken over Russia, and so sent in troops to help the Russian whites against the Russian reds. So basically the analogy to Osama bin Laden is actually pretty good. So basically Castro got interviewed and he used that for recruiting, and he took over the country. And of course he's got the death squads and he's killing people or whatever. Right. And, so there are things like basically before World War II, they reported that Poland had invaded Germany. Obviously they got the Iraq war. They reported that WMDs were in Iraq and fooled everybody. Their reporters recently were on, Twitter, like denying that COVID-19 was a big deal and calling you a paranoid, racist, whatever in January and February 2020. If you brought it up, close the borders. Oh my God, you're so evil. And then they turn around completely to pretending that they had always been concerned. And so the pattern is basically that they're the first rewrite of history. They basically go and get it wrong, often because of ideological reasons, or they don't understand the technology. They told, if I recall correctly, Goddard, the inventor of the rocket, that it would never work, and it did. They said like a few months before the Wright brothers had their plane, the first aircraft, they said, "Oh, flight will take like 1 million years; it'll never happen." Right. So they've been just wrong on lots of stuff. What they do though is they rewrite history to airbrush their own wrongs out, but bring up all of yours.
I saw
They're
this
going back to see
on your Twitter. You had retweeted an account that is calling out NYT errors and omissions, I believe.
Yeah,
and you're making the point, I think, to this point that that's a very important service, because no one's ever really done that.
That's right. I mean, look, they're doing a whole thing on 1619, but not 1933. That's to say, they're going back to, quote, slavery, but not the communist slavery that they enabled. Literally 5 million people, they covered it up. I mean, they should have the corporate death penalty for that. More than that, what else they didn't talk about? The New York Post had to report this. The Sulzberger family that controls, by the way, it shouldn't even really be called the New York Times or or even the New York Times company is public traded. It should be called Sulzberger's paper. It's a guy who owns it. It's just some guy. And that guy inherited from his father, who 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 inherited from his father. So it's everything they did. You didn't know that, right?
I didn't know that. No.
Yeah. So like it is everything they denounce and everything else. It is a rich white male nepotist who got his job on the basic connections, born a millionaire, who runs a paper that denounces first generation immigrants and self-made people as, quote, rich, when there's a huge distinction between born rich versus built rich.
Yeah.
You have this nepotist and his employees running around, putting up billboards, proclaiming themselves the literal truth.
Yeah.
Like, it's so embarrassing. Like, they have these billboards that they put up. Like, this ad campaign that I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Truth?
Yeah. I've seen
right.
that.
Like, no founder. And so like Elon is not arrogant. I love Elon, by the way, but Elon does not have a healthy enough arrogance to call himself the literal truth. Like,
that's pretty bad.
It's pretty ridiculous, right? Like there's, it's like every caricature, it's a concept, maybe the only useful thing from Freud, which is projection, right? These guys they're in an environment where it's all connections. It's all nepotism. How do you get rich? Because you inherited or you married somebody or you knew, they don't build anything. It's all, favor trading. It's like a royal court. Okay. And they assume that everything else is also like that. This total projection of their mental model. Of course you were lucky to build that company, because this other guy was lucky to know somebody to get a job at times when they're obviously a moron, right? And now one of the consequences of this is, I had this article, founding versus inheriting. The thing is that when it's like inherited many generations down, eventually you get somebody who doesn't know how to like run the factory.
The competence goes down, right? We're kind of back to the US government situation.
Yeah. or at least there's no mechanism to preserve competence.
Yes.
You know, like
Right.
the selection mechanism better work, you know?
Right.
So it was funny, by the way, is there's this whole, it's really useful to read these articles simply because it's so different. You know, these people are like, oh, you know, truth to power, blah, blah, blah. Like the MIT article on Sulzberger taking over as New York Times publisher is like, you know, it's like Kim Jong-un taking over from his father, like dear leader, you know, I'm probably getting it wrong, but like dear leader taking over from great leader. Okay. It is so completely different from how they would write about a corporate succession of anybody else other than their own guys. Okay.
Yeah.
And you know, the thing about this, which is really critical, is even this story is unusual because for the most part, it's not that the owners of these media companies get great coverage, it's that they get no coverage.
Right.
Okay.
By design.
Now, look, yeah, exactly. Like, you know, Zuckerberg, who, you know, like, I respect what he did. I understand that people disagree with, you know, some of his decisions and so on. But Zuckerberg is the son of a dentist. Sulzberger is the son of a millionaire. Zuckerberg built his fortune. Sulzberger inherited his.
Yeah.
Zuckerberg, whatever else, he's a self-made entrepreneur. He built a $3 billion, $1 trillion, 3 billion person communications network from a dorm room. And yeah, he did go to Harvard, but he dropped out. And he dropped out because he was canceled basically at Harvard for doing something, you know, that people didn't like at the time, the Face Mash app. But there's a lot of other people who went to Harvard who didn't build Facebook. Yeah. Thousands of people, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands. I don't know exactly how many graduates, it's like about 4,000 years, probably on there were hundreds of thousands who didn't build Facebook. And so that's merit. You know, you have to give him that. Like, you know, you may disagree with a lot of his decisions. You have to give him that, as opposed to, so what's interesting though, is they will write these pieces like, oh, Zuckerberg's children will inherit Facebook because he has dual class stock. Okay. So write these pieces. Here's this example. I'm just thinking about dual class. And I think it was like,
but they won't share their own origin story. I mean, it's purposefully obscured.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. And the reason that you and I can talk about this is that they have lost their lock on distribution. They're trying to put it back together. But here, just go and Google these two articles, right? How Punch Protected the Times from 2012 and You Can't Fire Mark Zuckerberg's Kids. These two articles are amazing because they're so Russell conjugated. Like Russell conjugation is I sweat, you perspire, but she glows. Same thing. It's just phrased differently. That's she glows, right? Like versus you're sweating, right?
Or glistens, probably, right?
Yeah, exactly. Whatever. Something which is like a positive tone glows. Right?
We're back to euphemisms, right? This is the state wrapping itself in euphemisms.
It's euphemism and it's dysphemism. Because your action, your normal action could be the tech bros seethed. Right. Whereas they clap back.
Right. All spin.
Like, it's all spin, but it's so embedded in the language. It's an org chart in the language. And here's a great example. These two articles, if you look at them side by side, basically in one of them, they talk about how great it was that the Sulzbergers protected the Times with this dual class stock. And the next one, it is 7 years later. So you have to have a memory for these articles. Okay. But it's the same editors, or it may not be the exact same editor. It is the same institution. Let me put it like that. Zuck is so evil for having dual class stock. So the thing is, it's not dual class stock which is evil. It is good if they do it and bad if you do it.
Right.
That's it. Right. Yeah. I mean, another example of this was something where the propaganda machine kind of broke down for them because it was like too much. They screwed it up. These articles shouldn't have come out so near each other, right? Yeah. So like the making of a YouTube radical, June 8th, 2019, how bad YouTube is in the US, right? And then looking for free speech in Russia, try YouTube, June 9th, 2019, right? And so basically, when they want to control the discourse within the US, YouTube is so evil because it's yelling and screaming people. When they're against Putin, because they don't yet have control over there, YouTube is good. right? So free speech is good if it undermines their enemy and bad if it undermines them. Dual class is good if it protects them. So it's purely tribal logic where whether they're, I often ask myself whether they're stupid or evil. Like stupid would be like lying in this way without understanding it. Evil would be consciously doing it. I think they used to be evil and they're moving more and more to stupid, just really believing their own stuff. And they're like, when these contradictions are pointed out, they don't actually have an answer for it because it's almost like repeating religious scripts where you couldn't actually even do it, point out that it was contradicted.